This wedding is ours, and you can't stop it. Heather's voice ripped across the lake like a blade. A full-blown luxury wedding was unfolding on a private dock that didn't belong to them. A flowing white gown, a towering three-tier cake sparkling in the sun, live music crashing over the calm water, guests laughing like it was their personal resort. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments because this is only the beginning. They thought no one would dare ruin their perfect day. But out here on the lake, dreams can drift away real fast. I bought my lakeside home 3 years ago for one simple reason: to escape the noise, the chaos, and frankly, the people of city life. After the divorce and losing my dad in the same brutal year, I needed somewhere to rebuild. Not just my career as a lake and riverside infrastructure engineer, but my sanity. My boat dock wasn't just a structure to me, it was an extension of my peaceful sanctuary, a place where I could sit with my morning coffee and watch the mist rise off the water without a single interruption. At least that's what I thought it would be. It was a Tuesday morning in late spring when I first encountered what I'd later come to know as the Karen sisters. I was heading down to my dock with my usual cup of coffee when I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There was a woman, maybe in her late 40s, lounging in a bright pink chair directly on my dock. Not near it, not beside it, on it. She was sunbathing like she owned the place, completely sprawled out with oversized sunglasses that caught the morning glare like mirrors. The smell of coconut sunscreen drifted on the breeze, mixing with the sound of her obnoxious laughter, cutting through my peaceful morning like a chainsaw. For a moment, I actually wondered if I was still asleep and having some kind of weird dream. I mean, who does that? Who just sets up camp on someone else's private property, like it's a public beach? Beside her was another woman, slightly younger, letting a small dog run loose across my dock, while music blared from a portable speaker. They were taking selfies, laughing loudly, and acting for all the world, like my dock was some kind of community park. I stood there for what felt like 5 minutes, just staring, trying to process what I was seeing. I approached them as politely as I could manage, clearing my throat to get their attention. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice friendly despite the complete bewilderment I was feeling. "I think there might be some confusion here. This is actually my private dock." The older woman, who I'd later learn was named Heather, looked at me like I'd just told her the sky was green. She folded her arms and said with the most condescending tone I'd ever heard, "You should be thanking us for bringing some life to this place. It's too beautiful to just be wasted like this all by yourself." I actually had to replay that sentence in my head twice to make sure I'd heard it right. Was she seriously suggesting that me using my own property was somehow wasteful? For a second I wanted to laugh. Maybe this was a joke, but her face told me otherwise. The younger sister Tiffany chimed in with what she probably thought was a helpful smile. "We're not hurting anything. Besides, it's such a lovely spot for gathering." I could feel my jaw tightening, but I tried to maintain my composure. "I appreciate that you think it's nice," I said, though I was starting to feel like I was in some kind of alternate reality. "But it's my dock." "Yeah, right. Thanks for trespassing," I muttered under my breath. Heather actually laughed at that. Not a polite laugh, but one of those dismissive sounds that makes you feel like you're 2 inches tall. "Oh, please," she said, waving her hand like she was swatting away a fly. "Don't be so dramatic." I just froze, coffee shaking in my hand. Hell no. Not my dock, but somehow words failed me. These women had this confidence that made me question my own reality, like they knew something I didn't. A few days later, they escalated things even further. I came home to find they'd brought chairs and potted plants to host what appeared to be an elaborate tea party on my dock. While setting up their little social gathering, I overheard Tiffany musing aloud to her sister, "You know, I think a small wedding ceremony here would be so beautiful." The words made my blood run cold, but what came next was even worse. Heather immediately seized on the idea like she'd been waiting for it, proclaiming with the confidence of someone who owned the place, "Of course, you deserve a classy wedding, and this dock will help you achieve it." That's when I knew this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a polite conversation. I was dealing with something else entirely, and honestly, I wasn't sure what to do about it. I stood there watching them pack up their things with the kind of leisurely pace that suggested they'd be back, and I found myself clenching my fists without even realizing it. Instead of just standing there fuming, I pulled out my phone and started recording video evidence of their trespassing, though my hands were shaking slightly from frustration. As they finally left, Heather turned back to me with a smug smile and said, This dock has been discussed and agreed upon by the HOA for community activities. At that moment, I was naive enough to think it was just a misunderstanding. Little did I know, this was just the warm-up act for what was about to become the most surreal battle of my entire life. I stood by my window that night, watching the empty dock in the moonlight, wondering if this was the end of my piece or if it was merely the beginning of something I hadn't yet dared to imagine. Word count 914. The next morning, I decided to handle this the right way, the civilized way. I gathered every piece of documentation I had about my property, the original purchase agreement, the detailed survey maps, the blueprints that clearly showed the boat dock as part of my lot. My hands shook slightly as I touched those dock blueprints, seeing Dad's handwriting, still visible in the margins after all these years. "Good drainage here," he'd written in his careful engineer's script. "Morning sun for coffee." We'd spent 3 weekends planning this dock before he got sick, sketching designs on napkins at the kitchen table, arguing about whether cedar or pressure-treated pine would last longer. "This dock's gonna outlive us both, son," he'd said, grinning as we marked the exact property lines on the survey map. I remember him teaching me how to read the water patterns, how to position the structure for maximum stability. We'd dreamed about lazy weekend mornings out there, coffee in hand, maybe teaching grandkids how to fish someday. Cancer stole those dreams, but it couldn't take away what we'd built together. Now, strangers were treating our carefully planned sanctuary like community property, and I felt something crack inside my chest that had nothing to do with property law and everything to do with the memory of my father's calloused hands pointing at those blueprints. I called the HOA office that afternoon, convinced my documentation would clear everything up in 5 minutes. "Oh yes," the woman on the phone said when I explained the situation. "We'll definitely look into that for you." But then as I started to explain the details about my property boundaries and the dock's construction history, her tone began to shift. "Well, Mr. She paused, shuffling papers. "We've received some concerns about residents being uncooperative with community activities." Uncooperative? I hadn't been uncooperative. I'd simply asked 2 strangers to stop using property that my father and I had designed with our own hands. The email responses were even more maddening form letters, thanking me for my concern while completely ignoring everything I'd actually said. I stared at my phone, pulse hammering. Did they seriously hang up on me? Was I losing my mind? Was wanting to use my own property somehow unreasonable? 3 sleepless nights later, I was seriously questioning whether I was the crazy neighbor everyone would whisper about. The doubt was eating me alive, gnawing at the edges of my confidence like water-eroding shoreline. During this bureaucratic nightmare, something even worse started happening: the social isolation. Neighbors who used to wave and chat suddenly couldn't make eye contact. At the mailbox, Mrs. Coley would see me coming and quickly grab her letters before hurrying inside. The Hendersons crossed the street when they saw me approaching. Word was spreading through the community like wildfire. I was the guy causing problems, the antisocial neighbor who wouldn't share his dock. I caught fragments of whispered conversations at the grocery store in the community center. "So selfish hoarding that beautiful dock. It's just a piece of wood. Why can't he share? Poor Tiffany planning her dream wedding, and he's trying to ruin it." Each comment felt like a small knife twist. Each sideways glance, another layer of social exile. I'd moved to this lakeside community specifically for the sense of belonging, the peaceful neighborly interactions. Instead, I'd somehow become the neighborhood pariah for defending what Dad and I had built together. The irony was suffocating. I was being ostracized for protecting the very thing that connected me to the only family I had left. Every whispered conversation felt like another shovel of dirt being thrown on my father's memory. But the real shock came when I went down to my dock the following weekend. Not only were Heather and Tiffany back, but they'd brought friends, 6 people this time, complete with coolers, multiple chairs, and music loud enough to register on seismic equipment. When they saw me approaching, Heather actually waved like we were old friends. "Oh, hi there," she called out cheerfully. "Don't mind us, we're just enjoying this beautiful community space." That's when I overheard something that made my blood freeze. Tiffany was on her phone speaking in low tones. "Yes, the adverse possession research looks promising. 3 more months of documented use and we can file the claim." I stepped closer, pretending to check my shoreline plants while straining to hear every word. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid they might hear it. This wasn't just entitlement, this was something far more sinister. The wedding's perfect timing. Heather whispered into her own phone, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Public event, lots of witnesses establishes our community use. My lawyer says if we can prove continuous occupation and improvement of the space. My hands started shaking as the full scope of their scheme became clear. They were trying to legally steal my dock through adverse possession laws, using every unauthorized gathering as evidence. Every interaction suddenly made horrible sense, the way they had brazenly referred to it as community property. Their confidence when talking to the HOA, the elaborate setups that seemed designed more for documentation than enjoyment. They weren't just using my dock, they were building a legal case to own it. The wedding wasn't about Tiffany's happiness, it was the final piece of evidence they needed to prove continuous community use. I felt sick realizing how thoroughly I'd been played, how every polite conversation had been part of their long-term strategy to steal something that represented everything my father and I had worked for. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the dock blueprints Dad and I had drawn together, his careful handwriting still visible like ghost whispers from the past. "Morning sun for coffee," he'd written next to a small arrow. "Good drainage here," he'd noted near the support posts. We'd planned every detail with the precision of engineers and the love of family, dreaming about lazy weekends and fishing trips that cancer stole from us. Now these women weren't just trespassing, they were trying to erase him to steal the last physical connection I had to the man who'd taught me everything about standing your ground. The betrayal cut deeper than any property dispute ever could. That dock wasn't just wood and nails to me, it was every conversation Dad and I had shared while planning it, every measurement we'd checked twice, every dream we'd built into its foundation. It represented his legacy, his engineering expertise, his belief that we could create something beautiful together. The thought of losing it to their calculated scheme felt like losing him all over again, like watching his memory be dissolved by legal technicalities and community manipulation. The following week brought a formal summons to attend a community meeting. I walked into that conference room hoping to present my case, but found myself facing what felt like a tribunal. Heather sat at the head of the table, like she was chairing a board meeting, while other HOA members nodded as she explained how my continued resistance was causing division within the community. I was formally warned that I would face penalties if I continued to obstruct approved community activities. The room felt like it was closing in on me, and I realized I was completely alone in this fight. That night, I noticed Heather on her phone again, pacing her deck while pointing toward my dock. She was making calls, lots of them, and every gesture looked like battle plans. Whatever scheme she was hatching, I had the sinking feeling I was about to discover exactly how deep this conspiracy went and how many people were involved in their systematic campaign to steal what my father and I had built together. The next few weeks were honestly some of the most frustrating of my entire life. I felt like I was trapped in this bizarre situation, where I was being gaslit by my own neighborhood association, and every attempt I made to resolve things civilly just seemed to make it worse. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, going over every conversation, every document, every possible angle I might have missed. Was there something in the HOA agreement I'd overlooked? The doubt was eating at me, and I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about my own situation. I spent 3 consecutive nights going through every single piece of paperwork related to my house purchase, spreading everything out on my dining room table like some kind of obsessive detective. Purchase agreement title documents, HOA, bylaws, property survey, dock blueprints, warranty information, inspection reports. I examined every page with the kind of meticulous attention I usually reserved for engineering projects. But after hours of searching, I still couldn't find anything that would help me. By the 3rd night, I was so frustrated that I actually started throwing the papers back into their folders. I slammed the folder shut, ready to torch the whole damn pile, then I saw it. That's when I ran into Mildred during my morning walk around the community. She'd been watching this whole drama unfold from her porch for weeks now, and I could tell she had something on her mind. "That dock of yours is certainly popular these days," she said with a knowing smile that suggested she understood exactly how frustrated I was. I groaned internally, thinking she was about to lecture me about being more neighborly or something. But then she said something that stopped me in my tracks. "I remember when they had to dismantle it for repairs about 8 years ago." I thanked Mildred and practically jogged back to my house, my mind racing with possibilities. If the dock had been dismantled before, there had to be documentation about it somewhere in all those papers I'd been poring over. I pulled out all my paperwork again this time, looking specifically for anything related to dock maintenance or structural modifications. I was getting ready to call it quits when a gentle breeze from my open window caught the corner of one of the blueprints, causing it to flutter and reveal a small section that had been folded under. One line in faded ink that stopped me cold. Detachable structure for maintenance and relocation as per HOA Regulation 222B. I actually had to read that line 3 times before it sank in. Detachable structure. My hands were literally trembling as I grabbed my laptop and started searching through the HOA regulations, something I'd done before, but never with this specific regulation number in mind. And there it was, buried deep in the maintenance and safety protocols, Regulation 222B, which allowed for the temporary detachment and relocation of certain waterfront structures for maintenance purposes, safety inspections, or in cases where the structure was being misused. As an infrastructure engineer, I knew exactly what this meant from a technical standpoint. The dock wasn't permanently bolted to the shore. It was designed with a connection system that allowed it to be detached when necessary. I'd never really thought about it before because I'd never needed to perform that kind of maintenance. But now that I was looking at the blueprints with this new information, I could see exactly how the system worked. It wasn't guesswork. I could see every bolt, every hinge. This thing was built to move. I spent the rest of that day carefully studying the dock's construction, walking around it with the blueprints in hand, identifying every connection point and understanding exactly how the detachment mechanism worked. From an engineering perspective, it was actually quite elegant. The dock could be separated from the shore without any damage to either structure and reattached just as easily. But the real beauty of Regulation 222B was that it put the decision about when maintenance was necessary squarely in the hands of the property owner. If I determined that the dock was being misused, then I was not only allowed, but actually obligated to take protective action. While I was planning and examining the dock structure, I noticed something interesting happening between the sisters. I watched from my window as Tiffany hesitantly approached Heather one afternoon while they were setting up yet another unauthorized gathering. "Sister," Tiffany said, her voice carrying just enough for me to hear, "are you sure Blake won't object to all this?" Heather dismissed her with an impatient wave of her hand. "He's weak," she said with complete confidence. "Just focus on planning your wedding. Leave everything else to me." But I caught the look on Tiffany's face. There was uncertainty there, maybe even a little guilt. If I did this, there was no going back. Was I ready for war over a dock? My hands were trembling, not from fear, okay, maybe a little, but from the thrill of having a real plan. The question wasn't whether I could do it. The question was when the perfect opportunity would present itself. I carefully traced the connection points on my blueprint one more time, my mind already working through the logistics of what I was beginning to think of as my maintenance project. The irony was almost too perfect. They'd been using the HOA rules to justify taking over my dock, but now I had an HOA rule that would let me take it back. That night, I sat on my back porch looking out at my dock, where thankfully no uninvited guests were currently camping out, and I felt a smile creep across my face for the first time in weeks. I'd found my secret weapon, and it was hidden right there in the HOA's own regulations. They wanted a wedding on my dock, fine. I'd give them one hell of a send-off. And somehow, I had a feeling I wouldn't have to wait very long for the perfect moment to strike. I thought I'd seen the peak of Heather and Tiffany's audacity with the grilling incident, but I was wrong. Dead wrong. It was a sunny Tuesday morning when I found a cream-colored envelope tucked into my front door handle, the kind of expensive stationery that immediately tells you someone spent way too much money on wedding invitations. At first I thought maybe it had been delivered to the wrong house. Why would I be getting a wedding invitation from people I barely knew? But when I opened it, I felt my jaw literally drop open. There in elegant script was an invitation to Tiffany's wedding, and the location, Our Dock, Crystal Waters Lake Community Area. Our Dock. They'd actually called it Our Dock on a formal wedding invitation. I read the line 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating, and each time it got more infuriating. Not only were they planning to host an entire wedding on my private property, but they'd gone so far as to rebrand it as a community space on official wedding stationery. I could feel my blood pressure rising as I imagined them sitting around their kitchen table, designing these invitations, casually referring to my dock as if they owned it. The sheer boldness of it was actually kind of impressive. in the same way that a particularly elaborate scam can be impressive even when you're the one being scammed. Years ago, I spent a whole summer sanding that dock by hand. My palms were raw, my back screaming, but I did it because that dock was freedom. The smell of wood stain, the satisfaction of every smooth board, the way it felt like building my own piece of paradise that was mine. Now it was being draped in white silk, hijacked for someone else's fairy tale. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected. This wasn't just about property lines anymore. This was about taking something I'd built with my own hands and turning it into a prop for their delusion. Over the next few days, I watched in fascination and growing horror as they began transforming my dock into what looked like a professional wedding venue. They brought in rental furniture, not just a few chairs, but elegant white tables, an elaborate arch for the ceremony, and enough seating for what had to be at least 50 people. There was a sound system, professional lighting equipment, and decorations that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. I stood at my back window one morning, coffee in hand, watching Heather direct what looked like a team of wedding planners as they arranged flowers and tested microphone equipment. But what really caught my attention was watching Tiffany during these preparations. While Heather was clearly in full control mode, directing every detail with the confidence of someone who'd done this before, Tiffany seemed almost uncomfortable with the whole thing. I caught Tiffany fiddling with a flower arrangement, her smile twitching like it was stitched on too tight. Her eyes kept darting toward the shore, toward me, as if she knew this wasn't right. I watched her hover around the edges of the activity, occasionally trying to adjust something, only to have Heather swoop in and change it back. "You stand here when the music starts," Heather snapped, positioning her sister like a mannequin. "And don't cry too much, it ruins the makeup." Tiffany just nodded weakly. "Right, okay." The more I observed this dynamic, the more I found myself wondering who this wedding was really for. Was Tiffany truly the bride, or was Heather just using her sister's wedding as an excuse to stage the elaborate event she'd probably always wanted for herself? The way Heather controlled every detail, from the placement of the flowers to the exact angle of the chairs, made it seem like Tiffany was more of a prop in her sister's production than the actual bride. It was almost sad to watch, and for a moment I actually felt a pang of sympathy for Tiffany. Almost. Then I remembered that she was still going along with using my property without permission. The final straw came when Mildred stopped by my house that weekend to let me know what she'd been hearing around the community. "I thought you should know," she said, lowering her voice like she was sharing state secrets, "that Heather and Tiffany have been telling everyone that you agreed to lend them the dock. They've been bragging that you wouldn't dare do anything to interfere with the wedding." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not only were they using my property without permission, but they were actively lying about having my consent. They were making me look like either a liar or a psychopath to my own neighbors. As Mildred turned to leave, she paused and leaned close, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "They think you're soft, son," she said, eyes glinting with something that looked almost like anticipation. "Prove 'em wrong." The way she said it made my spine straighten. This wasn't just neighborhood gossip. This was a battle cry from someone who had been watching bullies operate for decades. She knew exactly what was happening here, and she was giving me permission to do something about it. Her words hit me like a challenge I couldn't ignore. That evening I walked down to the lakefront and stood there for a long time just staring at my dock. The wedding decorations were beautiful. I had to admit, white fabric draped elegantly from posts, flowers cascading down the sides, string lights ready to create a magical ambiance. Under different circumstances, I might have even been happy to help with something like this. But these weren't different circumstances. This was theft, pure and simple, dressed up in white roses and elegant stationery. I felt this profound internal struggle as I stood there, my hand actually reaching toward one of the connection points, before I caught myself and pulled back. I spent that night sitting at my kitchen table, looking at the blueprint I'd photocopied and marked with all the connection points. This wasn't just about a boat dock anymore. This was about honor, about defending the rights of a property owner against what felt like organized theft, disguised as community spirit. I carefully traced each fastening point with my finger, timing out the sequence of operations I'd need to perform. The wedding was in 3 days, and I knew exactly when I needed to act. In my garage, I quietly gathered the tools I'd need: wrench, pliers, maybe a small pry bar. Everything laid out like surgical instruments, ready for precision work. The morning of the wedding dawned absolutely perfect, crystal clear skies, gentle breeze, temperature in the mid-70s. It was the kind of day that makes you understand why people pay thousands of dollars for lakeside wedding venues. From my kitchen window, I could see the early arriving vendors setting up sound equipment and making final adjustments to the decorations. By 10 o'clock, the transformation was complete, and I had to admit, it looked like something out of a magazine. White fabric draped elegantly from the ceremony arch, flowers cascaded down the sides of the dock, and even the chairs were positioned with mathematical precision to create the perfect aesthetic. The guests started arriving around noon, and I was genuinely surprised by how many people showed up. Cars lined the community parking area, and well-dressed wedding guests made their way down the path toward my dock like it was the most natural thing in the world. I recognized a few faces from around the neighborhood, but most were strangers, friends, and family who had no idea they were about to witness the most memorable wedding disaster in family history. I watched from my window as people mingled, took photos, and complimented Heather on the beautiful venue choice. Every compliment felt like a slap in the face, but I kept reminding myself that these people didn't know the truth. The day before, local police had stopped by my house after receiving what they called an oversight request from the HOA. "Mr. Blake," the officer had said with a tone that suggested this was routine, "we know you have a dispute with the HOA about the dock situation, but if you do anything to disrupt this wedding, you will be held fully responsible for any consequences." I'd simply smiled and nodded, assuring him that I had no intention of causing any trouble, which was technically true. I wasn't planning to cause trouble. I was planning to perform routine property maintenance. At 2:30, I casually walked out of my house and down toward the water, dressed in khakis and a polo shirt, like I was just taking a pleasant afternoon stroll. Nobody paid any attention to me. Why would they? As far as everyone knew, I was either the generous neighbor who donated his dock or just another guest enjoying the festivities. I positioned myself near the shoreline about 20 feet from where the dock connected to the land and checked my watch. 3:15 was go time, right when the ceremony was scheduled to begin, and everyone would be focused on the bride and groom. The music started at exactly 3 o'clock, and I watched Tiffany appear at the far end of the path in what I had to admit was a stunning wedding dress. She looked nervous but beautiful as she made her way toward the dock, followed by a small wedding party and about 50 guests. Heather was front and center, directing people to their seats and making sure every detail was perfect, clearly in her element as the self-appointed wedding coordinator. The groom, a pleasant-looking guy in his 40s who seemed genuinely happy to be there, took his position under the arch and waited for his bride with a huge smile on his face. As the officiant began the ceremony and Tiffany took her place beside her groom, I made my move. I crouched low, wrench biting into my palm, heart pounding like a war drum. Each bolt gave way with a metallic groan, every sound sharp enough to make me flinch and glance back at the laughing crowd. This wasn't some dramatic, destructive action. This was precision engineering. I moved calmly to the connection points I'd identified weeks earlier, and with the confidence of someone who'd designed and maintained waterfront structures for a living, I began the systematic detachment process outlined in HOA Regulation 222B. One groomsman broke from the pack heading toward the shore for a smoke. My stomach clenched. I froze, tools hidden behind my leg, trying to look like I was just examining the shoreline vegetation. He lit up, took 2 long drags while staring out at the water, then wandered back without a glance in my direction. Each connection point released smoothly and quietly, exactly as the system had been designed to work. The beauty of it was that it looked like routine maintenance to anyone who knew what they were seeing, which fortunately for me was exactly nobody at this wedding. For the first few minutes, nothing seemed to change. The dock continued to hold its position. The ceremony continued and I stepped back to observe my handiwork. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the dock began to drift. Just a few inches at first, then a foot, then several feet. I could see the exact moment when people started to realize something was wrong. There was a ripple of confused murmurs through the crowd. Then someone pointed at the widening gap between the dock and the shore. The officiant paused mid-sentence, looking around in confusion, and I heard someone in the crowd say, "Is this supposed to be happening?" What followed was absolute beautiful chaos. The realization hit the crowd like a wave. They were floating away from shore on what was apparently a detachable dock, and the gap was widening by the second. Screams erupted from the guests as people scrambled to figure out what was happening. Tiffany's dress soaked up lake water as she stumbled backward, the white silk turning translucent and heavy. Heather was screaming commands no one could follow, her voice cracking with panic. A guest dropped their phone mid-live stream, the device disappearing into the lake with a splash. The sound system shorted out with a sharp crack, leaving only the sound of panicked voices and sloshing water. The elaborate three-tiered wedding cake, which had been positioned near the edge of the dock, toppled over with a spectacular splash that sent waves across the surrounding water. Musicians grabbed their instruments and tried to move toward the center of the dock, while elderly relatives clutched their chairs and stared at the growing expanse of water between them and dry land. Part of me felt bad for the guests. They were innocent victims in this whole mess. But then I remembered Heather's smug grin, her dismissive wave, the way she'd called my dock community property, and any guilt drowned faster than that three-tiered cake. But the absolute best part, the moment I'll remember for the rest of my life, was watching the different reactions from the sisters. Heather's face went completely ashen as she realized what was happening, and she stood there screaming in rage and disbelief, pointing at the shore like she could somehow will the dock back into place. "What is happening?" she shrieked, her voice carrying clearly across the water. "How is this possible?" Tiffany, meanwhile, looked more bewildered and horrified than outright angry. As the chaos erupted around them, I heard Tiffany turn to her sister, with panic in her voice. "Sister, what have you done?" But Heather, even in the middle of this disaster, couldn't let go of her need to control everything. From my position on the shoreline, I crossed my arms and allowed myself a small smile of satisfaction. The dock was now about 30 feet from shore and drifting steadily toward the center of the lake, carrying its cargo of shocked wedding guests like some kind of bizarre party barge. The Heather's dock sign that someone had apparently made for the occasion had come loose and was floating nearby, a perfect metaphor for their entire scheme. I called out across the water, my voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. "What a beautiful view! A complimentary, unexpected cruise." By the time the police sirens wailed in the distance, I was leaning on my porch rail, sipping bourbon, like it was just another lazy Sunday. The fire department's water rescue team handled the evacuation with remarkable professionalism, considering they'd probably never been called to rescue a wedding party from a drifting dock before. The guests were ferried back to shore in small groups, most of them soaking wet and looking like they'd survived some kind of natural disaster rather than attended a social event. I have to give them credit. They managed to get everyone back safely, without any injuries, though the bride's dress was completely ruined, and several elderly guests needed assistance due to the shock of the whole experience. Within a week of the wedding cruise incident, as it was being called, around the community I received legal papers that made my eyes water. Heather had hired what appeared to be a top-tier attorney and was suing me for property damage, disturbing the peace, emotional distress, and my personal favorite, intentional destruction of a wedding celebration. The compensation they were demanding was frankly astronomical, enough money to buy several replacement docks and probably fund a few more weddings. I'll admit, when I first saw those numbers, I felt a moment of genuine anxiety. Even if I was completely in the right, legal battles are expensive and time-consuming. I spent the better part of 2 days consulting with my own attorney, a sharp woman who specialized in property disputes and HOA conflicts. After reviewing all my documentation, she looked up at me with a grin that told me everything I needed to know. "This is actually pretty straightforward," she said. "They're claiming you damaged their event, but they can't explain how they had the right to hold the event in the first place. Plus, you didn't actually damage anything. You performed a legitimate maintenance procedure as outlined in your HOA regulations. The dock is designed to be detached. You followed the proper procedure, and you can reattach it anytime you want." But I wasn't content to just defend myself. I decided to go on the offensive. I started reaching out to neighbors who'd witnessed Heather and Tiffany's behavior over the weeks leading up to the wedding. It turned out that a lot of people had been quietly documenting their disruptive activities, and several were willing to testify about the unauthorized parties, the loud music, and the general disrespect for property boundaries. I also made sure that some of the footage I'd recorded of the drifting wedding found its way onto local community boards, where it quickly became a source of both humor and outrage among residents who were tired of HOA overreach. The preliminary court hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and I'll be honest, I was nervous. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and old paper, with fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly sickly. My chair creaked every time I shifted loud enough to make me feel like everyone was watching. My shirt clung to my back, and I couldn't tell if it was sweat or fear, maybe both. Heather's attorney was clearly expensive and experienced, and he came armed with photo evidence of the wedding disaster, witness statements from traumatized guests, and a detailed argument about how my actions had caused severe emotional and financial damages. For about 20 minutes, as he presented his case with polished professionalism, I started to wonder if maybe I'd been too clever for my own good. Legal proceedings have a way of making even the most justified actions seem questionable when you're sitting in a courtroom being accused of ruining someone's special day. Heather's lawyer gestured dramatically at photos of soaked wedding guests. "Your client intentionally sabotaged a sacred family event," he declared, his voice dripping with righteous indignation. My attorney, calm as ice, leaned back in her chair and smiled. "By following the rules your client swore to uphold, fascinating logic." The courtroom rippled with barely suppressed snickers. But then it was our turn, and my attorney systematically dismantled their entire argument. She presented the doc blueprints, the property deed, and the HOA regulation that explicitly authorized my actions. She showed photos of the unauthorized parties and gatherings that had been taking place on my dock for weeks. And then she played her ace, the recorded conversations and text messages that proved Heather had knowingly used my property without permission, while telling others I'd agreed to it. The judge listened to all of this with an increasingly skeptical expression, occasionally asking Heather's attorney to clarify how exactly his clients had obtained permission to use someone else's private property. The moment that sealed their fate came when the judge asked Tiffany directly whether she'd ever spoken to me about using the dock for her wedding. I watched as she glanced nervously at Heather, then at her attorney, then back at the judge. The pressure of being under oath, combined with weeks of growing resentment toward her controlling sister, finally broke through whatever loyalty had been keeping her quiet. Tiffany's voice cracked, and when she choked out, "I told you to ask for permission," you could feel the entire room inhale at once. Heather's face hardened like concrete while Tiffany crumbled mascara streaking down her cheeks. Then, as her lawyer pressed her for more details, the floodgates opened. Tears streaming down her face, she turned to Heather and sobbed. "I told you, Heather. We should have just asked for permission. I didn't want to use someone else's dock like that." The courtroom went completely silent. For a second, I almost pitied her. Almost. But then I remembered all those weeks of invasion, all those dismissive waves and condescending smiles. Heather's face went white, and I could see her attorney frantically taking notes, probably trying to figure out how to minimize the damage from his client's sister, throwing her completely under the bus. "So much for Queen Heather," someone whispered behind me, the comment carrying just loud enough for half the gallery to hear. My attorney then presented additional evidence that I hadn't even known she'd obtained audio recordings and chat messages that showed Heather had explicitly pressured Tiffany to go along with using the dock and had dismissed any concerns about getting proper permission. The judge's expression grew increasingly stern as he listened to Heather's voice on the recording, saying things like, "He's too weak to do anything about it," and "Possession is 9/10 of the law." It was devastating testimony that completely undermined their case and exposed Heather's manipulative nature for everyone to see. When the judge announced his verdict 2 hours later, I felt a satisfaction that was almost overwhelming. Not only was I completely vindicated, but Heather and Tiffany were ordered to pay my legal fees, compensate me for the emotional distress and property invasion I'd suffered, and this was the part that really made my day. Heather was officially removed from her position on the HOA board for abuse of authority and creation of community discord. As we left the courtroom, I caught a glimpse of the sisters walking separately toward the parking lot, no longer speaking to each other, their relationship apparently as damaged as their reputations. The compensation money from the lawsuit was substantial enough to not just repair my dock, but to completely transform it into something even better than it had been before. I invested in premium weather-resistant materials and added personal touches that turned it from a simple boat dock into a true waterfront sanctuary. Fresh cedar planks gleamed in the sunlight, their honey tones glowing against the deep blue of the lake. The scent of wood oil lingered in the air like victory. I installed comfortable built-in seating with weather-resistant cushions, subtle solar lighting that created a warm ambiance in the evenings, and even a small planter box where I could grow native lakeside plants. The dock renovation became something of a neighborhood spectacle, but in the best possible way. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance started stopping by to chat, while I worked offering words of support and sharing their own stories about HOA conflicts they'd been afraid to address. "You're a legend, Blake," old Mr. Henderson told me, slapping my back with genuine admiration. "Finally, someone shut her down," Mrs. Garcia added, shaking her head with satisfaction. It turned out that Heather's reign of terror had affected more people than just me. She'd been using her position to bully residents into compliance with her personal preferences for years. This wasn't just a doc anymore. It was proof that you can fight back without screaming, proof that quiet persistence beats loud entitlement. Every plank I laid, every bolt I tightened felt like reclaiming something bigger than just property. It was reclaiming dignity. Respect the right to exist peacefully in your own space. One neighbor told me about how she'd been fined for having the wrong color mailbox flowers, another about being written up for parking his work truck in his own driveway overnight. My victory had apparently given other people the courage to speak up about their own experiences with HOA overreach. The social consequences for Heather were swift and devastating. Within weeks of the court decision, she went from being the neighborhood's self-appointed queen to being completely ostracized. No more invitations to community events, no more casual conversations at the mailbox, no more social gatherings where she could hold court and dispense her opinions about how everyone else should live their lives. The nickname Karen's sister became permanently attached to her around the community, whispered with a mixture of amusement and warning whenever her name came up. 2 weeks later, I saw Heather in the grocery store. No designer handbag, no smug smile, just a cart of generic cereal and eyes that wouldn't meet mine. But the real tragedy was what happened to the relationship between the sisters. The courtroom revelation had shattered whatever bond they'd once shared, and the aftermath only made things worse. Tiffany's wedding, such as it was, had been completely ruined, and while her fiancé had been understanding about the bizarre circumstances, the stress and embarrassment had put a serious strain on their relationship. She spent weeks fielding questions and explanations from friends and family who couldn't quite believe what they'd witnessed. Meanwhile, Heather blamed Tiffany's testimony for her downfall, convinced that if her sister had just kept quiet, they might have won the lawsuit. The financial impact of the legal fees and compensation payments was crushing for both of them. Heather, who had apparently been living beyond her means for years to maintain her image as the neighborhood's social leader, found herself in serious debt. The legal costs alone had drained whatever savings she'd had, and the compensation she owed me put her in a financial hole that would take years to climb out of. Tiffany, who had spent her life savings on what was supposed to be her dream wedding, was left financially devastated by her share of the legal costs. The stress of their situation combined with their mutual resentment created a rift that seemed to grow wider every day. The inevitable end came about 2 months after the court decision, when both sisters put their houses on the market within a week of each other. The community grapevine buzzed with speculation about where they were going and whether they'd ever reconcile, but I honestly didn't care about the details. What mattered to me was that they were leaving, taking their drama and their sense of entitlement with them. They sold their properties at below-market prices, apparently eager to escape the community where they had once wielded so much influence and suffered such spectacular public humiliation. As for me, I became something of a local legend. My story spread beyond our immediate community, and I started receiving messages from people dealing with their own HOA bullies, asking for advice about how to stand up to neighborhood tyrants. Some of these stories were heartbreaking: elderly residents being fined into bankruptcy over minor violations, families driven from their homes by arbitrary rule enforcement, creative homeowners crushed under the weight of bureaucratic nitpicking. It made me realize that what I'd experienced wasn't unique. It was part of a larger pattern of petty authoritarianism that seems to flourish in HOA environments. I earned profound respect from other residents who saw me not just as someone who had won a legal battle, but as a clever, patient, and courageous individual who'd stood up to HOA overreach when everyone else had been too intimidated to try. My boat dock, now beautifully restored, became a local symbol of justice and the triumph of individual rights over petty tyranny. It was a quiet testament to a battle won without resorting to the same level of irrationality as my opponents had shown. The final touch to my renovated dock was a small, elegantly crafted wooden sign that I had made by a local artisan. On quiet evenings, I'd sit on my beautifully restored dock, watching the sun set over the lake, and I'd reflect on how the whole experience had changed me. I'd learned that sometimes the only way to deal with bullies is to use their own weapons against them, that patience and preparation can be more powerful than anger and confrontation, and that standing up for yourself doesn't always require being loud or aggressive. Sometimes justice comes quietly, legally, and with a surprisingly decisive unmooring. That evening, as the lake turned to molten gold under the sunset, I sat on my rebuilt dock with a glass of bourbon and a smile sharp enough to cut through the last echoes of their laughter. I guess that's it. Me sitting on that rebuilt dock, bourbon in hand, watching the lake glow like molten gold, and wondering how a couple of sisters with a wedding obsession thought they could bulldoze me out of my own life. Truth is, I learned something out there. Patience and a good plan will humble the loudest bully every single time. You don't always need to scream. Sometimes all it takes is a quiet little twist that nobody sees coming. Yeah, it feels good. No point pretending otherwise. If you've ever had your own HOA nightmare or some neighbor who thought they ruled the world, tell me about it in the comments because, honestly, I'd love to hear how you handled it. If this one gave you that little rush of satisfaction, hit like, maybe subscribe to QA Stories so you don't miss the next wild ride we dig into. And hey, if you want to keep these stories flowing and, keep me stocked in late night coffee for the next one, there's that thanks button down there. No pressure, but it means more than you know. All right, I'm signing off for now. Take care of your space guard, your peace, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
QA Stories thanks you for hanging out today. Don't forget to binge a few more. Trust us, you'll be hooked.